How has Congress reacted to the growing power of the president? How has that affected them?
Congress has in many ways fed the well springs of the growth of presidential power through abdication of its own responsibilities, a failure to protect its own turf in the area of war making and national security and foreign affairs. Its abdication to presidential aggrandizement of power has essentially knocked down barriers that presidents otherwise would have confronted in their own assertion of broader and broader authority. In addition to that, Congress, through the passage of statutes, has delegated away many of its powers to the president. In addition to all of that, Congress has stood on the sidelines as presidents have commandeered more and more authority. So Congress has not defended its turf, and thus one of the important checks on presidential assertion of power has essentially withered away. And now many people wonder, will Congress ever reassert itself and try to trim the sails of the presidency?
Well, let's look at one of those powers, foreign policy. Can you discuss the president's general role in foreign policy under the Constitution?
It's another area in which the assertion of presidential power far exceeds what the Constitution gave to the president. The president's principal powers in the area of foreign affairs involved the role that he would play as commander-in-chief. And presidents have effectively invoked commander-in-chief to do anything that could be done with an army, treating an army at the president's beck and call. But students need to know that the framers of the Constitution did not grant to the president, through the commander-in-chief clause, the authority to take the nation into war or even to initiate military hostilities, because those powers were granted solely and exclusively to Congress through the War Clause in Article 1, Section 8. It's also the case that the president's role in the formulation of foreign policy was very limited. If you think about the clauses in Article 2 that grant the president a role, we talk first of all about the treaty-making power. Well, that's a shared power with the Senate, even though presidents have come to assert that it's a presidential power, and Congress, or excuse me, the Senate is simply asked to rubber stamp a president's treaty. But the framers did not assign to the president the sole role of negotiation. It was expected and indeed illustrated in George Washington's presidency that he consulted with the Senate in the formulation of treaties. The other role assigned to the president is through what we call the reception clause. The president shall receive foreign ambassadors and ministers. The framers of the Constitution understood this was just an administrative clerk-like duty carried out, as Alexander Hamilton had explained in Federalist 69, a duty performed typically by ceremonial heads of state across the world, simply meeting and greeting the visiting dignitary. But President Wilson became the first president to convert that ceremonial clerk-like role into a towering power to conduct foreign policy. And from that point forward, presidents have used that slender reed of presidential power to assume responsibility for deciding what other nations the United States would have relations with, what the scope of those relations would be, the tenor and tone of those relations, essentially pushing Congress to the sidelines. So those are the only foreign policy roles assigned to the president. Congress has granted the bulk of foreign relations powers, but as we've observed, Congress has essentially abdicated those powers and allowed the president now to commandeer these critical roles.
So obviously in times of war, people are going to defer to the commander-in-chief. That's to be expected. So can you talk about how presidents have exceeded their powers granted by the Constitution in times of war or emergency? You mentioned Lincoln a moment ago. What other examples have there been?
First of all, James Madison observed that war would be the, quote, true nurse of executive aggrandizement of power. Precisely in times of war, the nation looks to the president for defense and protection. President Truman, during the Korean War, actually took the nation into war without congressional authorization, and before the UN Security Council even authorized it from the standpoint of international law. He claimed the Commander-in-Chief Clause grants to the president the authority to make that critical decision to take the nation into war.
Was that the first time in our history where a president did that?
That was the very first time, that's right, and that's pretty late in our history for a president to claim constitutional authority to go to war. Since Truman, every subsequent president, with the exception of Dwight Eisenhower, has asserted the Commander-in-Chief Clause as unilateral authority to go to war. And so Truman took us down a very unfortunate path. In the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, President Bush, in the wake of 9/11, expanded presidential power in unprecedented ways, asserting the Commander-in-Chief Clause authority to conduct enhanced interrogations, to establish military tribunals without congressional authorization, and to engage in a host of other actions. So one of the problems that we've faced is that the assertion of the Commander-in-Chief Clause by modern presidents far exceeds what the framers had in mind. And indeed, as Alexander Hamilton explained in Federalist 69, the president essentially becomes Commander-in-Chief in one of two circumstances. One, if Congress declares war or otherwise authorizes military hostilities, then the president, in his role as Commander-in-Chief, is expected to prosecute the war successfully, we hope. Second, if the United States is attacked, then the president as Commander-in-Chief is expected to repel the invasion. It's an emergency situation, and the president needs to act quickly. But as soon as the invaders are driven out, the framers believe, then the issue turns to Congress to decide what our policy ought to be. Maybe going to war, maybe declaring war, maybe suing for peace, who knows, but it's a congressional determination. But presidents now treat the American military as their own private army and decide to initiate hostilities or promote broader warfare in accordance with their own policy desires. But it should be said that the Supreme Court at the dawn of the Republic, in several cases in 1800, 1801, 1803, 1804, and 1806, pointed out that Congress has the sole authority to initiate hostilities. The president has no such authority. And in an 1804 case, the Supreme Court reprimanded President John Adams for his conduct of war during the war with France, 1798 to 1800, for exceeding his statutory authority, and reminded the president as Commander-in-Chief that the president still is required to obey the instructions and directions of Congress, even in the conduct of war.
Has Congress ever tried to regain its power during wartime or emergencies, or has it just been complicit in this growing power of the president?
Congress made an attempt in the passage of the War Powers Act of 1973 to reclaim some of its authority, lost to Presidents Johnson and Nixon in the Vietnam period. Unfortunately, Congress unwittingly ended up granting to the president more authority than the president derives from the Constitution. Because the president has no authority under the Constitution to initiate military hostilities, we see that one of the great flaws in the War Powers Act of 1973 is that it allows the president to use force for a period of up to 60 days without requiring authorization from Congress. So that's a surrender of the war power. Congress cannot delegate away its legislative powers, as the Supreme Court has said since the earliest days of the Republic. And so that reflected, unfortunately, the fact that members of Congress were not well tutored in their own constitutional powers and well tutored in the allocation of foreign affairs and national security powers between the President and Congress.
Is it fair to say that Congress just hasn't fulfilled its constitutional obligations when it comes to declaring war?
I think that's very true. Congress has, in fact, only officially declared war, formally declared it on 11 occasions. Sometimes students read that it's occurred on 5 occasions. It's 11. But Congress has effectively stood on the sidelines while presidents for the past half century have made war in a variety of places, from Central America to Asia to the Middle East, without performing its duty. And sometimes Americans are confused. Congress does not actually have to formally declare war on an enemy of the United States. Rather, all that's required is that Congress authorize those hostilities. And going all the way back to the early days of the Republic, for example, in the quasi-war with France, 1798 to 1800, Congress passed 24 statutes authorizing President John Adams to use force against France. So Congress does need to regain its authority over the war-making power, because the framers of the Constitution did not want a single person to make that most fateful decision about when the nation should go to war. They rejected the idea of unilateral presidential war-making, and instead they embraced the idea of Congress making that decision on the premise that before we go to war, we should have a very clear discussion and debate about the desire to go to war, with full understanding about the high cost to the country that war can often bring.